The alien empress summoned me, then discovered I was her daughter's lover. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the observation deck of the diplomatic transport ship, watching the crystalline spires of the Velathi throne world grow larger through the viewport. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. In his 5 years as a courier for the human diplomatic corps, he had delivered messages to dozens of alien species across known space. He had walked through methane-breathing cities and stood before council chambers filled with beings that could crush him with a thought. But none of that compared to this moment. The summons had arrived 3 days ago, transmitted directly from Empress Seraphine Kavira herself. Not to the human ambassador, not to Earth's planetary council. To him, by name. The message had been brief and terrifyingly specific. Captain Jake Morrison was to present himself before the Velathi throne within the week. Failure to comply would result in the termination of all human trade agreements within Velathi space. His superiors had nearly collapsed when they saw it. The Velathi Empire was ancient, powerful, and notoriously isolationist. They had ruled over 40 star systems for 3,000 years, while humanity was still figuring out how to make fire. Their technology made human ships look like children's toys. Their military could glass a planet before breakfast. And they considered humans to be barely civilized newcomers, granted trade rights only because the galactic community insisted on it. Ambassador Chen had pulled Jake aside before he boarded the transport. The older woman's face had been creased with worry. She gripped his shoulder hard enough to hurt. "Whatever you did, Morrison, fix it. Our entire presence in this sector depends on you not screwing this up." Jake had wanted to tell her that he had no idea what he could have possibly done to attract the personal attention of an alien empress. But the words stuck in his throat, because that would have been a lie. He knew exactly why he was here, or at least he suspected. And if he was right, he was walking into a trap that could destroy everything humanity had built in this part of the galaxy. The transport shuddered as it entered the planet's atmosphere. Through the viewport, Jake could see the capital city spreading out below like a garden of glass and light. The Velathi built everything from a crystalline material that grew rather than being constructed. Their buildings rose in organic spirals and curves, catching the light of their blue sun and scattering it into rainbows. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. The ship landed on a platform near the palace complex. As the airlock cycled open, Jake was met by 6 Velathi guards in ceremonial armor that gleamed like liquid mercury. They were tall, at least 8 feet each, with scales that shifted between blue and purple depending on how the light hit them. 4 arms hung at their sides, 2 holding ceremonial weapons that Jake knew from his briefings could slice through starship hull plating. The lead guard spoke in perfectly accented English, his voice like gravel sliding down a metal pipe. "Captain Morrison, you will come with us. The Empress is waiting." They walked through corridors that seemed to have been carved from a single massive crystal. Light moved through the walls in patterns that might have been decorative or might have been some form of communication he could not understand. Other Velathi moved past, their scales displaying colors Jake had learned indicated different castes and roles. All of them stopped to stare at the human being escorted through their palace. The throne room was exactly as intimidating as Jake had imagined. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, supported by pillars that pulsed with soft light. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, and at the far end, elevated on a dais of white crystal, sat Empress Seraphine Kavira. She was massive, easily 9 feet tall even seated. Her scales were a deep imperial purple that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 4 arms rested on the throne, each adorned with rings and bracelets that Jake recognized as symbols of conquered worlds and signed treaties. Her eyes were golden and slitted, and they fixed on him with the intensity of a predator watching prey. The guard stopped 20 feet from the throne and bowed deeply. Jake, following protocol he had memorized, dropped to one knee and lowered his head. The Velathi considered eye contact from an inferior to be an act of aggression. "Captain Jake Morrison of Earth." The Empress's voice filled the chamber without her seeming to raise it. It resonated in his bones. "You may rise and approach." Close enough to see the way her claws tapped against the armrest of her throne, in a rhythm that might have been impatience or calculation. "Your Majesty," Jake said, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. I am honored by your summons. How may I serve the Velathi Empire? I have been observing human activity in the outer territories with growing concern. Your species has been spreading influence at an alarming rate. Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, joint research initiatives. You arrive in systems where the Velathi have maintained order for millennia, and within months, everything begins to change. We believe that mutual benefit. I summoned you because you, specifically, have been identified as a person of interest. You have spent considerable time in the Veros system over the past 6 months. Trading, you claimed, building relationships with local merchants. Veros was where he had met Lysa, where everything had started. Yes, Your Majesty, the Veros system has been very welcoming to human trade. I have made several trips there to facilitate. Her golden eyes seemed to pierce through him. Your species forms emotional attachments with alarming ease, does it not? You call it love. You build entire civilizations around this concept. You make decisions based on these emotional bonds, rather than logical calculation. Love, friendship, loyalty. These bonds inspire us to protect each other, to work together, to sacrifice for the greater good. Throwing yourselves into danger for those you care about. Very noble, very foolish. She stood, and Jake had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact now that she had granted it. Love is a weakness, Captain Morrison. It clouds judgment. It leads to poor decisions. It makes one vulnerable to manipulation and pain. The Velathi abandoned such primitive emotional attachments centuries ago. We arrange unions based on genetic compatibility and political advantage. We raise offspring in collective creches to prevent inappropriate bonding. We have built an empire that has lasted 3,000 years because we do not allow ourselves to be ruled by feelings. With respect, Your Majesty, Jake heard himself say, even though every survival instinct screamed at him to stay silent. Humanity has observed that the Velathi Empire has also been locked in the same political structures for those 3,000 years. Sometimes caring about something beyond pure logic leads to growth and change. It was not a comforting expression. Interesting, you have courage at least, or stupidity. I have not yet determined which. She descended from the dais, each step echoing in the vast chamber. She moved with fluid grace despite her size, circling him like he was a specimen to be examined. I am going to share something with you, Captain Morrison. My daughter, Princess Lysa Kavira, heir to the Velathi throne, has been behaving strangely for the past 6 months. She has been advocating for policy reforms. She questions traditions that have stood for millennia. She speaks of mercy and understanding and other concepts that have no place in imperial governance. Her advisors are concerned. I am concerned. Learning about their cultures. The Empress stopped in front of him, so close he could smell something like cinnamon and ozone. She spent considerable time in the Veros system. The same system where you, Captain Morrison, have been conducting your trade negotiations. The Velathi all look quite similar to human eyes. Her claws rested against his uniform jacket, sharp enough that he could feel them through the fabric. I have access to monitoring systems throughout Velathi space, Captain, communications, travel records, security footage. I know my daughter has been meeting with someone in secret, someone she goes to great lengths to hide from her guards and advisors, someone who makes her feel things that an heir to the throne should not feel. I also know, the Empress continued, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, which was somehow more terrifying, that you have been filing inaccurate reports about your activities in Veros. Your stated trade negotiations could not possibly account for the amount of time you spent on that station. You have been lying to your superiors, Captain Morrison. The question is why. It was gentle but insistent, like someone knocking on a door. Telepathy was not uncommon among Velathi nobles, though they rarely used it with other species. The touch was familiar, desperately familiar. Lysa's mental voice filled his head, tight with fear. She knows. Run. Even from this distance, he could see the terror in her golden eyes. She was shaking her head minutely, warning him. The Empress followed his gaze and smiled that terrible smile again. Ah, yes, there she is, my daughter. Tell me, Captain Morrison, do you recognize her now? The guest quarters they assigned Jake were luxurious in the way that gilded cages often are. The walls were made of the same crystalline material as the rest of the palace, but these had been tinted a soft amber that made the light feel warm. There was a bed that adjusted itself to his body weight, a bathroom with water that somehow knew the exact temperature he preferred, and a window that overlooked the capital city spreading out below in spirals of glass and light. It was beautiful and completely monitored, Jake was certain. Every word he spoke, every move he made was being recorded and analyzed. The Empress had not demanded an immediate answer when he stood frozen in the throne room, unable to deny or confirm what she clearly already knew. Instead, she had simply gestured to the guards and said he would be given quarters to rest before dinner. Dinner. A private meal with the Empress herself. Jake had been in enough diplomatic situations to know that nothing about this was standard protocol. This was an interrogation dressed up in formal clothing. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. Everything was falling apart. 6 months of careful secrecy, of stolen moments and hidden meetings, of the most incredible relationship he had ever known, and it was all crashing down because he had been stupid enough to think they could keep it hidden forever. He should have known better. Lysa had warned him from the beginning that her mother had resources beyond human comprehension. The Empress did not rule an empire for 3 centuries by being unobservant. The telepathic connection between him and Lysa had faded after that brief moment in the throne room, but Jake could still feel it there at the edge of his consciousness. It was one of the things that had surprised him most about their relationship. Velathi could form telepathic bonds with other species if the connection was strong enough, if the emotions ran deep enough. What the Velathi considered a weakness, a dangerous vulnerability, had become the foundation of something Jake had never experienced before. He could sense Lysa's presence like a warm light in his mind. Right now, that light was flickering with fear. A chime sounded at the door. Jake stood, smoothing down his uniform jacket even though he knew it was wrinkled from travel and stress. The door opened without him touching it, and a Velathi servant entered carrying formal dinner clothes on a tray. The servant was smaller than the warriors, maybe 7 feet tall, with scales that shifted between green and blue. "The Empress requests your presence for dinner in 1 hour, Captain Morrison," the servant said in English that carried a musical accent. "These garments have been prepared for you. The Empress expects proper formal attire." The Empress was demonstrating that she knew human customs, that she had prepared for his arrival, that she was always 3 steps ahead. He thanked the servant and dressed after they left. The outfit was a formal diplomatic suit in dark blue, perfectly tailored to his measurements. Because of course the Empress would know his exact size. 50 minutes later, guards arrived to escort him to dinner. They led him through different corridors this time, past rooms where he caught glimpses of Velathi nobles engaged in activities he did not understand. In one chamber, several Velathi sat in a circle with their eyes closed, their scales pulsing with synchronized light. In another, young Velathi practiced with weapons under the watchful eye of an instructor. Everything was precise, ordered, controlled. The Velathi had built their entire civilization on the rejection of chaos, on the elimination of unpredictability. Love was chaos. Emotion was unpredictable. Jake was walking evidence of everything they had spent millennia trying to eliminate from their culture. The dining room was smaller than the throne room, but no less impressive. The table was carved from a single piece of black crystal that reflected the light from floating orbs overhead. Place settings had been laid for 2, 1 at each end of the long table. The Empress was already seated, and she watched him enter with those piercing golden eyes. "Captain Morrison, please sit." She gestured to the far end of the table with one of her 4 hands. Jake sat, very aware of the distance between them. It was deliberate, he knew. Everything the Empress did was deliberate. The distance made conversation difficult, forced him to speak louder, made intimacy impossible. It was a negotiation tactic. Servants began bringing food. The Velathi were omnivorous, and the Empress had apparently ordered a meal that would be compatible with human digestion. There were vegetables that looked almost Earth-like, but shimmered with an inner luminescence, protein that had been synthesized to taste like chicken, and a grain dish that smelled of spices Jake could not identify. It was thoughtful in a way that made him more nervous, not less. "Tell me about Earth, Captain," the Empress said, selecting food with 2 of her hands while the other 2 remained folded in her lap. "I have read reports, of course, but I find that official documents rarely capture the truth of a place. What is it like, your homeworld?" "But we are learning slowly." Most species take millennia. The Velathi took 2,000 years. What is your secret, Captain Morrison? How does such a fractured, emotional, chaotic species achieve so much so quickly? We do not always know the right path forward, so we try everything. We fail constantly. But we learn from those failures, and we care enough about each other to keep trying. You speak of caring, of emotional bonds. Let us discuss that directly, shall we? I grow tired of dancing around the subject. She leaned forward slightly. I know you have been meeting with my daughter, Captain. I know you have formed what your species would call a romantic relationship. I know that Lysa has been sneaking away from her duties, lying to her guards, and behaving in ways that are completely unacceptable for the heir to the Velathi throne. What I want to understand is why. I know the facts, Captain Morrison. What I am trying to understand is the motivation. What could you possibly offer my daughter that would make her throw away centuries of tradition? What human trick did you use to compromise the future empress of the Velathi Empire? She is brilliant and strong, and she made her own choices. I see a young, inexperienced human who encountered a Velathi princess and saw an opportunity, political advancement, prestige. Perhaps you thought you could use her affection to gain advantages for your species. Perhaps you simply wanted the novelty of bedding royalty. Either way, you have manipulated my daughter for your own gain. She came to Vero's station disguised as a common merchant. She wanted to experience life outside the palace, to meet beings who would treat her as a person rather than a title. We talked. We became friends. And yes, eventually we fell in love, but it was real, Your Majesty. Neither of us planned it. Neither of us wanted the complications it would bring. It just happened. And in the 6 months since this love just happened, what changes have you noticed in my daughter, Captain Morrison? She advocates for mercy in judicial decisions. She proposes reforms to systems that have functioned perfectly well for millennia. She speaks of equality and compassion and other dangerous concepts. She has been infected with human weakness, and you are the source of that infection. To consider that there might be better ways to govern than simply doing things the way they have always been done. That is not weakness. That is growth, and I will not allow it to continue. Lysa was laughing at something Jake had said, her scales showing the pale purple that indicated happiness in Velathi color language. They looked happy. They looked like any couple in love. I am going to make you an offer, Captain Morrison, the Empress said, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. You will leave Lysa. You will return to Earth and never contact her again. You will tell no one about your relationship with her. In exchange, you will be allowed to live. More than that, humanity's trade agreements in Velathi space will not only continue, but will be expanded. Your species will gain access to technologies and resources that would advance your civilization by decades. All you have to do is walk away from my daughter and never look back. And if I refuse, every trade agreement, every cultural exchange, every joint research project will be dissolved. Your species will be blacklisted from Velathi space for the next 1,000 years. Your ambassador, Chen, who has worked so hard to build relationships here, will see everything she has accomplished destroyed, all because you could not control your emotions. Millions of humans benefited from the Velathi trade agreements. Medicine, technology, knowledge, all of it would be lost, and it would be his fault for being selfish enough to love someone he should never have touched. I need time to think, he managed to say. The Empress deactivated the tablet and tucked it away. You have until tomorrow morning. I suggest you consider carefully, Captain Morrison. Some things are more important than love. Duty, for instance. Responsibility. The good of your people. She turned and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. My daughter will beg you to accept my offer, you know. She cares about you enough that she will want you to live, even if it means never seeing you again. That is what love does, Captain. It makes you weak. It makes you willing to sacrifice your own happiness. Think about that tonight. He sat by the window and watched the lights of the city below, trying to figure out what to do. Hours passed. The door chimed. Jake knew who it would be before he opened it. Lysa stood in the corridor, her scales pale with stress, her 4 hands trembling slightly. She looked at him with those golden eyes that he had fallen into the first time they met, and he saw everything she was feeling written across her face. She told you, Lysa said. It was not a question. Yes. For a moment they just stood there, two beings from different worlds who had somehow found each other despite all the reasons they should not have. Then Lysa crossed the distance and wrapped all four of her arms around him, pulling him close. Jake held her, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. Velathi hearts beat slower than human ones, a deep, steady rhythm that he had grown to love. "You have to accept her offer," Lysa whispered into his shoulder. "You have to leave me and save your people. And I am not going to abandon you just because your mother is trying to scare me. There has to be another way. We cannot fight her, Jake. We can only try to minimize the damage." "Someone found out I am gone." "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry I brought you into this." Where before it had been vast and empty, now it was crowded with Velathi nobles in their formal robes, each displaying the colors and patterns that indicated their rank and bloodline. They sat in tiered seating that rose up on either side of the central aisle, and every single one of them was staring at Jake and Lysa as if they were specimens in a laboratory. The murmur of conversation died the moment the Empress entered and took her seat on the throne. Jake stood with his hands bound behind his back by energy restraints that hummed against his wrists. Lysa stood beside him, similarly bound, though her scales had gone almost white with stress and shame. The guards had dragged them here separately, giving them no chance to speak or plan. Jake had spent the night in a holding cell, staring at walls and trying to figure out how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong so quickly. The Empress surveyed the assembled council with calm authority, then turned her golden eyes to her daughter. "Princess Lysa Kavira, heir to the Velathi throne, you stand accused of consorting with an alien in violation of the purity laws. You have lied to your guards, abandoned your duties, and brought shame upon the imperial bloodline. How do you answer these charges?" "I do not deny the facts as stated, but I reject the notion that I have brought shame to anyone. I have done nothing wrong." The Empress's expression did not change, but her claws tapped against the armrest of her throne in that calculating rhythm Jake had noticed before. "Nothing wrong," the Empress repeated slowly. "You believe that violating laws that have stood for 3,000 years is not wrong. The purity laws were created in a different era when the Velathi were isolationist and afraid of outside influence. We are not that species anymore. We trade with dozens of alien civilizations. We participate in galactic councils. We cannot claim to be part of a larger community, while simultaneously declaring that our blood must never mix with theirs. The purity laws exist to protect Velathi genetic integrity and cultural identity. To abandon them would be to abandon everything that makes us Velathi. Every species in the galaxy except us has abandoned these outdated restrictions. And what has it cost them? Nothing. Meanwhile, we stagnate in our perfection, so afraid of change that we cannot even consider the possibility that we might be wrong. This is a trial." She turned her attention to Jake, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. "Captain Jake Morrison of Earth, you stand accused of corrupting the heir to the Velathi throne and attempting to undermine the stability of the Empire. The penalty for this crime is death. Have you anything to say before sentence is passed?" Then a memory surfaced, something he had read in his preparation briefings about Velathi culture. It was old, maybe obsolete, but it was the only card he had to play. "I invoke the right of proving," Jake said clearly. The throne room went absolutely silent. Every Velathi in the chamber turned to stare at him. The Empress leaned forward, her four hands gripping the armrests of her throne. "What did you say?" "According to ancient Velathi law, any person accused of a crime has the right to prove their worth through a challenge of the accuser's choosing. If they succeed, all charges are dismissed. It is one of the oldest laws in your legal code. It is a relic from a barbaric past, before the Velathi embraced civilized justice. That same law grants me the right to prove my worth. The right of proving has never been formally repealed, merely fallen into disuse. Very well, I accept your invocation." The Empress stood, and the entire council rose with her. "Captain Jake Morrison, you claim that you are not a corrupting influence. You claim that your relationship with my daughter is based on genuine affection rather than political opportunism. You claim that humanity deserves respect and partnership rather than mere tolerance. Very well, I will give you the opportunity to prove all of these claims. The Velathi Empire has been locked in a territorial dispute with the Kreth Dominion for 700 years. The conflict centers on the Zareth Nebula, a region rich in rare minerals that both our species claim as ancestral territory. Countless diplomatic sessions have failed to resolve the issue. 3 times we have come to the brink of war, and 3 times we have pulled back only because the cost would be too devastating for both sides. The greatest minds in the Empire have attempted to find a solution. All have failed. If you succeed, all charges against you and my daughter will be dismissed. You will have proven that humanity has something valuable to contribute to galactic civilization. You will have proven that you are worthy of the trust my daughter has placed in you. She will die because she knowingly violated our laws and refuses to renounce her actions. You will die because you have proven yourself to be exactly what I suspected, an opportunistic fool who overestimated his own capabilities. The Empress returned to her throne and sat with perfect composure. Do you accept this challenge, Captain Morrison? Her eyes were wide with fear, but she was shaking her head frantically. Her voice came into his mind through their telepathic link. Do not do this. Accept her original offer. Please, Jake, this is impossible. You will die, and it will be my fault. The Empress was not giving him a chance to prove himself. She was giving him enough rope to hang himself with, and ensuring that Lysa would hang beside him for her defiance. But if he accepted the original offer, he would lose Lysa forever. Humanity would gain technology and trade agreements, but Jake would spend the rest of his life knowing he had abandoned the person he loved to save himself. He would become exactly the kind of opportunist the Empress accused him of being. And there was something else, something that had been nagging at him since the Empress first described the challenge. 700 years was a long time for a conflict to remain unresolved. That suggested it was not really about territory or resources. There was something else driving it, something that all the brilliant Velathi diplomats had missed because they were looking at it through Velathi eyes. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the Empress, in her cunning way, was actually giving him a real chance. She knew that Velathi thinking had failed to solve this problem. Maybe she wanted to see what human thinking could accomplish. Or maybe she just wanted to watch him fail in the most spectacular way possible. Either way, Jake had already made his decision the moment the challenge was offered. I accept, he said. The Empress nodded as if she had expected nothing less. Very well, you will be provided with a small ship, basic supplies, and a translator, nothing else. The Kreth do not respond well to shows of force, so you will travel alone. You will not be permitted to contact Earth or any human authorities for assistance. This challenge is yours alone, Captain Morrison. He rubbed feeling back into his hands and tried to project more confidence than he felt. Lysa's mental voice was screaming at him, a mixture of terror and anger and desperate love. You stubborn, stupid, wonderful fool. Why did you not just walk away? Prepare a ship for immediate departure. She looked at Jake with those unreadable golden eyes. 10 days, Captain. The clock begins the moment you leave Velathi space. She was still bound, still surrounded by council members who looked at her with disappointment and disgust. But she was standing straight, her scales showing flashes of the imperial purple that marked her as her mother's daughter. She met his eyes and he felt her presence in his mind, warm and steady despite her fear. Come back to me, she sent. Whatever happens, come back. I am not going to let your mother win this easily. A Velathi technician was loading supplies into the cargo hold, food, water, medical supplies, and a translation device that would allow him to communicate with the Kreth. The Kreth Dominion is 3 days' travel from here, the technician said without looking at Jake. Your ship has been programmed with the coordinates of their primary diplomatic station. They have been notified that you are coming, though they seemed confused about why the Velathi would send a human to negotiate. You will find that confusion to be the least of your problems, Captain. The Kreth are not known for their patience with outsiders. They were designed for Velathi hands, which meant he had to stretch awkwardly to reach some of the interfaces, but he could manage. The ship's computer activated with a soft chime and displayed a countdown timer. 9 days, 23 hours, 47 minutes. As the hangar doors opened and Jake guided the ship out into space, he felt Lysa's presence fade from his mind. Distance weakened their telepathic connection. Soon he would be completely alone, traveling into the territory of an alien species he knew almost nothing about, trying to solve a problem that had defeated expert diplomats for 7 centuries. He should have been terrified, Part of him was. But another part, the part that had fallen in love with an alien princess, despite all the reasons it was impossible, felt something else. Hope. Because if there was one thing humans were good at, it was finding unconventional solutions to impossible problems. The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, and the stars stretched into lines. Jake pulled up everything the ship's computer had about the Kreth Dominion and started reading. He had 9 days to learn everything he could about a species he had never encountered. 9 days to find an angle that centuries of Velathi diplomacy had missed. And 9 days to figure out how to save the woman he loved from an empress who had never lost a political battle in 300 years. The Kreth border station loomed ahead, a massive structure of dark metal that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Jake had spent 3 days reading everything the ship's computer had about the Kreth Dominion, and what he had learned made the challenge ahead seem even more impossible. The Kreth were a warrior culture that valued honor above all else. They were insected in appearance, standing nearly 10 feet tall with 4 legs and 2 arms that ended in razor-sharp claws. Their exoskeletons were black and reflective, and their compound eyes could see across a wider spectrum than most species. They were formidable, proud, and according to every report Jake had read, absolutely unwilling to negotiate on the Zarath Nebula dispute. But Jake had also noticed something in his research. Something that kept appearing in the historical records, but that every Velathi diplomat seemed to have overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant. 732 years ago, right before the dispute began, a Kreth ambassador had been killed during negotiations with the Velathi. The official records called it an accident, a tragic misunderstanding during a heated discussion. The Kreth records, which Jake found buried in historical databases, told a different story. They called it murder. As Jake's ship approached the station, his communication system crackled to life. A harsh, clicking voice came through, translated into English by his device. "Human vessel, you are entering Kreth territorial space. State your purpose or be destroyed. I request permission to dock and speak with your leadership. We do not waste time with lesser species, acting as messengers for our enemies. The Velathi have tried to solve this conflict from their perspective for 7 centuries. Maybe it is time someone approached it from a different angle." Jake could imagine the Kreth on the other end consulting with their superiors, trying to decide if this was worth their time or if they should just blow his ship out of space and be done with it. "You may dock," the voice finally said. "But you will be searched and escorted at all times. Any sign of deception or aggression will result in your immediate execution. The Kreth do not tolerate dishonor." Kreth guards met him at the airlock, their massive forms making Jake feel like a child. They searched him thoroughly, confiscated anything that could be used as a weapon, including his communicator, and then marched him through corridors that were dimly lit by Kreth standards, but nearly dark to Jake's human eyes. The station smelled of something metallic and organic, and the temperature was significantly warmer than Jake was comfortable with. They brought him to a large chamber where several Kreth waited. The one in the center was clearly the leader, with markings on his exoskeleton that Jake's research suggested indicated high rank. The Kreth leader studied Jake with compound eyes that reflected the dim light like black mirrors. "I am War Leader Thexar," the Kreth said, his translated voice carrying a tone of barely controlled aggression. "I command this sector and oversee all negotiations with the Velathi, though they have been pointless for centuries. Why does the Empress send a human to waste our time? If I succeed in brokering peace between the Kreth and the Velathi, I win my freedom and the freedom of someone I love. If I fail, we both die. And you came anyway. Because I am human, and we see things differently than the Velathi do. Humans see that this conflict is not really about the Zarath Nebula. It is about honor, about a death that happened 700 years ago and was never properly acknowledged." The Kreth guards shifted, their claws clicking against the metal floor. Thexar leaned forward, his enormous form suddenly radiating focused intensity. "Continue," he said quietly. 732 years ago, Ambassador Krether was killed during negotiations with the Velathi, Jake said, keeping his voice steady. The Velathi called it an accident, but the Kreth knew it was murder. A Velathi commander lost his temper during a heated discussion and struck Krether with enough force to crack his exoskeleton. Crether died 3 days later from his injuries. The Velathi never apologized, never acknowledged wrongdoing, never even admitted that their commander had acted dishonorably. They hide behind their pride and their claims of superiority. They act as though Kreth lives are worth less than their precious dignity. Both sides claimed it, but the Kreth had a stronger historical claim. The Velathi pushed the issue anyway, and the Kreth pushed back. Not because the nebula was so valuable, but because you could not let another insult pass unanswered. You could not let the Velathi take something from you when they had already taken Ambassador Crether's life without consequence. The Velathi diplomats speak only of resources and territory and legal precedents. They do not understand that honor matters more than any mineral deposit. We do not fight for the nebula. We fight to prove that Kreth lives have value, that our dead deserve acknowledgement. To apologize would be to show vulnerability, and they have spent 3,000 years eliminating vulnerability from their society. And the Kreth will never yield without that apology. This conflict will continue until one side or the other is destroyed, or until the heat death of the universe. Those appear to be the only options. The Velathi will never apologize because they see it as weakness. But what if someone convinced the Empress that apologizing is actually a demonstration of strength? What if someone showed her that the ability to acknowledge fault and move forward is not weakness but evolution? What makes you think you can succeed? We have hurt each other and destroyed our own planet and nearly wiped ourselves out a dozen times. But we are still here because we learned to say we were sorry and mean it, because we learned that pride is not worth more than progress. I need you to trust me, War Leader Thexar. I need you to give me a chance to present a solution to the Empress. But I also need something from you. If I can get the Empress to publicly acknowledge what happened to Ambassador Crether, if I can get her to offer a genuine apology on behalf of the Velathi Empire, will that be enough? Will the Kreth accept peace? The other Kreth in the chamber watched him, waiting for his decision. Finally, he spoke. If the Empress herself, not some minor diplomat or proxy, publicly acknowledges that Ambassador Crether was murdered by a Velathi commander, and if she offers a formal apology that includes restitution to Crether's bloodline, then yes, the Kreth will accept peace. We will cede our claim to the Zareth Nebula. The 700-year conflict will end. And we will declare war immediately. Total war, not the cold standoff we have maintained for centuries. Do you understand what you are risking? He was betting everything on his ability to convince the most proud and stubborn leader in the galaxy to do something she had never done before. And if he failed, he would not only die alongside Lysa, but he would trigger a war that could kill billions. I understand, Jake said. And I accept the terms. No more messages through intermediaries. No more diplomatic games. The Empress faces us directly or there is no deal. Jake's small ship was accompanied by 3 Kreth warships, their presence a statement that could not be ignored. As they approached the throne world, Jake sent a priority transmission requesting an immediate audience with the Empress. He included a brief summary of his proposal and the Kreth terms. The response came within hours. The Empress would see him, but she made no promises beyond that. They docked at the same diplomatic hangar Jake had departed from 5 days earlier. The Kreth delegation was met by a full honor guard of Velathi warriors, weapons ready but not raised. The tension was thick enough to cut. Jake walked between the two groups, very aware that he was the only thing preventing violence from erupting. The throne room was even more crowded than it had been during the trial. Every member of the High Council was present, along with military commanders, diplomatic advisors, and what looked like representatives from every major Velathi family. Lysa stood to one side of the throne, still under guard but no longer bound. Her eyes met Jake's, and he felt her presence in his mind again, warm and worried and desperately hopeful. The Empress sat on her throne, her expression unreadable. War Leader R and his delegation stood on one side of the aisle. Jake stood alone in the center, between two species that had hated each other for 7 centuries. "Captain Morrison," the Empress said, her voice filling the chamber, "you return with Kreth warships. This is either the most brilliant negotiation in galactic history or the most catastrophic failure. Which is it? All they ask in return is something that costs you nothing, but means everything to them. The Empress raised one hand and silence fell, but her eyes were dangerous. You dare ask me to apologize to the Kreth, to show weakness before the entire galaxy. You told me that love is weakness because it requires vulnerability. You told me that the Velathi abandoned emotion to become strong. But I am standing here, right now, because love gave me the courage to attempt the impossible. I am here because I care about your daughter more than I care about my own safety. That is not weakness, Your Majesty. That is the strongest thing a person can do. 700 years ago, a Velathi commander killed Ambassador Krether in a moment of anger. It was wrong. Everyone knows it was wrong, but the Empire never acknowledged it because that would require admitting fault. So instead, you have spent 7 centuries locked in a pointless conflict, wasting resources and lives, all because your pride will not let you say 3 simple words. I am sorry. Here is what we value: growth over stagnation, progress over pride, the future over the past. We make mistakes constantly. We are foolish and emotional and chaotic, but we survive because we learn from our mistakes instead of pretending they never happened. That is what I am offering you, not weakness, evolution. Mother, you have ruled for 300 years because you are brilliant and strong and ruthless. But Jake is right. Strength is not the same as inflexibility. You taught me that an empress must put the empire above all else. He has given you a way to end a 700-year conflict without firing a shot. The question is whether you can put the empire above your pride. The Kreth delegation tensed, ready for violence. But the Empress simply looked at the war leader with her golden eyes and spoke in a voice that everyone in the chamber could hear. 732 years ago, Commander Zelthan of the Velathi Imperial Guard struck Ambassador Krether of the Kreth Dominion during diplomatic negotiations. The blow was intentional. The ambassador died from his injuries. This was murder, and it was a stain on Velathi honor that has never been properly addressed. She paused, and Jake could see the effort it cost her to continue. On behalf of the Velathi Empire, I apologize. We were wrong. Ambassador Krether's death was a crime that should have been acknowledged and atoned for. I cannot undo the past, but I can offer restitution to his bloodline and my word that such dishonor will never occur again. The Kreth Dominion accepts your apology, Empress Seraphine. The conflict ends today. The Zarath Nebula is yours. Let there be peace between our peoples. Others joined, slowly at first, then building into a wave of sound. The Empress returned to her throne and sat, her expression still unreadable, but Jake thought he saw something that might have been relief in her eyes. She looked at him and gestured with one hand. Captain Morrison, you have succeeded where centuries of diplomacy failed. The charges against you and my daughter are dismissed. You have proven that humanity has value, and more importantly, you have proven that you are worthy of the trust Lysa has placed in you. He held her close, not caring who was watching or what they thought. The Empress stood again. However, I will not pretend that I am pleased about this relationship. You will face opposition from those who believe in the old ways. You will have enemies who see you as a threat to Velathi purity, and you will have to navigate a political landscape that has never dealt with anything like this before. But I think we can handle it. After all, you just taught the most stubborn being in the galaxy that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you were wrong. If you can do that, perhaps you can do anything. Their relationship was now public knowledge, debated and discussed across Velathi space and human territories alike. There was opposition, certainly. There were protests and angry editorials and calls for the old laws to be enforced. But there was also support, from younger Velathi who saw them as symbols of change, from humans who were proud that one of their own had accomplished the impossible, and from other species who saw hope in the idea that old barriers could finally fall. The Empress had begun implementing reforms, carefully and slowly, testing the waters of change. The purity laws had not been repealed, but exceptions were being discussed. Cultural exchange programs were expanding. And most importantly, the peace with the Kreth was holding strong, opening up new possibilities for cooperation across the galaxy. Do you ever regret it? Lysa asked, leaning against Jake as the sun set over the crystalline city. Everything you risked, everything you went through. Then he thought about this moment, standing here with Lysa, watching a future unfold that neither of them could have imagined. Not for a second, he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Lysa smiled and pulled him closer. and somewhere in the palace behind them, an empress who had ruled for 300 years without ever showing weakness, allowed herself a small moment of pride in the daughter who had been brave enough to teach her that love was not weakness. After all, it was strength, the strongest thing in the universe.